Long before their independence from England had been achieved, the colonies were home to a wide variety of people. Some were indigenous people who saw their homelands irrevocably changed by colonization. Some were colonists tired of living under the thumb of the English crown and felt independence from the mother country was necessary by any means. Still, others considered themselves loyal subjects of the king and wanted to be treated as British subjects no different from those in the mother country. Often overlooked are the fence-sitters, who were undecided and made up a large group, even after the conflict had started. And enslaved people and indigenous peoples had their own interests, vulnerabilities, and power, and were excluded from the conversation in distinctive ways. In North Carolina, for example, some enslaved and indigenous communities considered fighting for the British in hopes of raising their station, believing that a stronger British rule would bring with it racial equality. Up and down the eastern seaboard, people had countless opinions about whether or not to fight, if they were lucky enough to have a choice. But all would be involved as the colonies and the different people they contained barreled towards the American Revolution. I'm Dr. Danielle Bainbridge, and this is Study Hall, U.S. History to 1865. The French and Indian War was technically part of the larger 7 Years' War between France and Great Britain. Referred to as the First World War by Winston Churchill, it was severely bloody and extremely costly. It was also interpreted really differently by the colonists and many people in England. In the colonies, the aftermath included a series of laws passed by the British Parliament, meant to increase political authority over the colonies and render them more profitable. And while those acts seemed like reasonable legislation to some, to others it was a step on the path to tyranny. One of the first of these was the Stamp Act, passed in March of 1765. Previously, each colony's individual government had controlled the tax rates in that colony. Now, it felt like the crown was reaching directly into people's pockets, especially since stamps were required on a wide range of things: newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. The Stamp Act was eventually repealed, but more legislation was passed with the same goal: to increase wealth for Britain. In the years that followed, tension ebbed and flowed, and many colonists remained uninterested in conflict with the mother country. Other colonists began to think about and protest something that had not seemed very important earlier: colonists' lack of representation in Parliament. So the distance between the king and Parliament's view of proper colonial governance and many colonists' view was growing. In March of 1770, things came to a head in Boston. Imagine a town in which soldiers and locals had lived together during a long winter, with tension growing over politics, probably some resentment over competition for part-time work, and a mutual conviction that the other guys were arrogant. The colonists became violent, taunting the soldiers and throwing whatever they could find at them. Soldiers fired into a crowd. Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and indigenous American descent, was among the first killed and has henceforth been known as the first American to die for the Revolution. This event served as a rallying cry for colonists eager to separate from the English monarchy. Henry Pelham, an American-born engraver from Boston, created a depiction of the massacre in which the British soldiers appear to be the aggressors, which helped create sympathy for the anti-British cause. The engraving was copied and distributed by Paul Revere of the Midnight Ride fame. Another colonist whose name you'll recognize, John Adams, defended the British soldiers who were brought to trial for their role in the massacre. Adams was also part of the resistance movement, but he believed that the colonists must claim the high ground strategically and sincerely by respecting the rule of law. For a long time, Great Britain tried to exert more control and extract more money from the colonies. Sometimes it looked like they might succeed, and the chance of conflict receded. But those moments did not last. Not all the colonists were protesting for the same reasons. Some were angry at their lack of economic opportunity at home, and others were more focused on relations with England, and the protests grew. In December 1773, perhaps the most famous protest in all American history occurred. Colonists were protesting the Tea Act, which might actually have lowered the price of tea for many colonists, but it disadvantaged colonial merchants and once again disrupted colonists' sense of local control. The Sons of Liberty and other colonists, thinly disguised as Mohawks, crept aboard several ships docked in the Boston harbor and dumped over 92,000 pounds of tea overboard. The group of rebels made a point of not harming any crew or damaging the ships themselves. They were rebels, not vandals, and they wanted that fact known. This event later became known as the Boston Tea Party. We should note that the tea in the harbor that night belonged to the British East India Company. Many shareholders of that company were members of parliament and took this as a personal attack. Meanwhile, colonists were protesting in other ways as well. During the days following the Stamp Act, many colonists boycotted by refusing to buy stamps. Some even went as far as to attack the home of the Boston tax collector, Andrew Oliver. During all of these boycotts, colonial women's roles took on a new significance. Whatever British goods were being boycotted at any given time, women had to figure out a workaround. For example, they came up with homespun or homemade cloth to clothe their families. In fact, the majority of British textiles were boycotted at one point or another, and women were responsible for finding ways to replace those products. For men and women alike, motivations at protests were mixed with an endless list of dissatisfactions. However, many protest leaders sought to distance themselves from the mob. They merely wanted to be treated as Englishmen, not to be independent from England. Still, in 1774, the first meeting of the Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia. This was the first attempt at an American government in defiance of England's authority. To punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passed the 1774 Coercive Acts. In America, colonists grouped them with the Quebec Act, and they became known as the Intolerable Acts. This was a set of 4 laws, all related to the Tea Party. First up was the Boston Port Act, which was designed to blockade Boston's harbor and close the port to most traffic. Next, the Massachusetts Government Act allowed Parliament to replace all of the elected officials in Massachusetts, using the excuse that the ousted officials were succumbing to pressure from mobs. The Act for the Impartial Administration of Justice, say that 5 times fast, allowed British officials charged with capital crimes to be tried in other colonies, or better yet, in England. And the fourth of the Intolerable Acts, the Quartering Act, allowed British officers to commandeer unoccupied buildings and use them for housing. The fact that the colonists called these intolerable speaks volumes about their feelings toward the laws being imposed on them. But the Parliament didn't stop there. The Quebec Act allowed Canadian colonies acquired after the war with France to practice Catholicism, angering the Protestant colonists in New England. The seemingly punitive measures and taxes being levied against Britain's North American colonies was in fact what united the colonies against them. By early 1775, many colonists had begun to form militias in an effort to demonstrate some control over their governance. In April of that year, British soldiers mobilized and marched into Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, intending to seize weapons and quash any chance of rebellion. Instead, shots were fired, though historians still debate by which side. And despite some colonists' hopes for a peaceful resolution, in June 1775, the Second Continental Congress created an army with George Washington as its head. There was no going back now. Lines were being drawn on all sides. Enslaved people and people of color also faced the question of where their liberty lay. Some would decide that the cause of independence was theirs too, but others risked their lives to fight with the British, often in response to British offers of freedom to those who joined their lines. Many people, enslaved and free, recognized the contradiction between colonial demands for liberty and colonial reliance on racial slavery. The British sometimes exploited that contradiction, but they had no intention of destroying slavery completely in the colonies, because Parliament, like many colonists, wanted to preserve the revenue the institution created. The Union of the 13 Colonies wasn't an easy one either. When the Second Continental Congress convened, it was the height of summer in Philadelphia. The attendees struggled to agree, but by July 4th, 1776, all of them had adopted the Declaration of Independence. But that pretty parchment document took some time to write out, and it wasn't actually signed until August 2nd. With the signing of the Declaration, many colonists believed they were officially their own country, separate from British rule. To respond, Great Britain adopted and abandoned multiple strategies through the Revolution, which we'll only touch on here. First, the British tried to isolate New England. They believed that that was where the rebel leaders were coming from, despite the Declaration of Independence clearly showing support for the war throughout the newly founded states. The French, still the nemesis of Britain following the French and Indian War, saw that they shared a common enemy. American soldiers brokered an alliance with France, providing the American army with much-needed resources against the far better equipped British army. The alliance also added credibility to the brand new United States. Partnering with a European power drew attention to the Americans' cause. The British responded to the failure of their first strategy by adopting a southern strategy, believing that colonists in the South were more loyal to the crown and that their desire to preserve slavery would prevent them from rebelling. The revolution in the South did look in many ways like a civil war, and African Americans pursued their liberty in many ways, including by fighting with the British. However, this strategy also failed for a variety of reasons, including the unintentionally radicalizing effect of marching the British Army through American territory and the help of the French in trapping British forces at Yorktown. Throughout the war, there was one constant. The British could not convert their military victories into political persuasion, and the colonists could. And eventually, the British politicians and public came to believe that the price of continuing the war in America was too high. By 1781, the war was leaning in the Americans' favor, and the British sought to protect their valuable colonies in the Caribbean instead of the North American mainland. This brought with it the final phase of the war. The French Navy had gained control of the Chesapeake Bay, and General Washington rushed his troops south in order to trap British General Cornwallis and over 7,000 of his troops. While the war wouldn't officially end for another 2 years, it was effectively over following this famous surrender at Yorktown. The war was concluded with negotiations that played out well for the Americans. They would control everything east of the Mississippi River and south of Canada. John Jay, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin were key to these successes thanks to their negotiations in Paris. They were even able to secure fishing rights for the Americans in the Atlantic, which to this day is more than half of the world's fishing grounds. The British negotiated on behalf of their loyalists, but completely abandoned their indigenous allies, who were not even present at the negotiations. Most of their enslaved and formerly enslaved allies were abandoned as well, but the British evacuated some to Canada, where there are still towns to this day that can trace their lineage to British loyalists. While the American Revolution is often credited with granting freedom to a new nation, it's critical to note that indigenous groups, enslaved and formerly enslaved people, and women continued to face various forms of institutional prejudice after the war ended. And while some groups were aided by policies passed in early America, others simply saw their discrimination codified. Well, we'll get to that next time. Thanks for watching Study Hall U.S. History to 1865, which is part of the Study Hall Project, a partnership between ASU and Crash Course. If you like this video and want to keep learning with us, be sure to subscribe. You can learn more about Study Hall and the videos produced by Crash Course and ASU in the links in the description. See you next time.